So today we're going to focus on the differences between complete and incomplete sentences, or complete sentences and sentence fragments in this particular video. So it's really important as you're watching this to take the time to pause the video anywhere where you need to so that you can fill in the blanks in your handout in your interactive notebook. So the first thing we're going to focus on in this video is the requirements for a complete sentence. So complete sentences really need three things. And probably the easiest thing to find if you are looking at a complete sentence is going to be the action of that sentence, which is the verb. So verbs are words like to run, to walk, to jump, sleeping, playing, woke, things like that. So you're looking at action in any verb tense that appears in the sentence. Now, the second thing you need to look for is the person or the thing doing that action, and that is what we call the subject. So that can range anywhere from people to places or things, depending on the context of the sentence. So your subjects are typically going to be those nouns that we've talked about a little bit before, and that should be review information for you. And then lastly, in order to be a complete sentence, you not only need a subject and a verb, but that sentence needs to form a complete thought that can stand alone and make sense without any additional details. So it's got to be independent. You can't add any more things to it. Well, you can, but you don't need to. So that complete sentence needs to make sense and have a complete thought. Other terms that you might hear in class or during the course of this video for complete sentences might be something called an independent clause. And that's an interesting word because complete thoughts are independent. They don't need anything else to stand on their own. So they are independent, if you will. You can also call a complete sentence a complete thought because it doesn't need any additional details to be complete. So just keep an eye out for those additional terms and know that if I'm saying one of those two things, I'm still talking about a complete sentence. So if we're looking at some example sentences, number one says the kids played in the street. So played here would be the verb, and the people doing the action are the kids. And if you read this and think that you don't need to add any more details, then that means it's a complete thought. So we can check all three of those boxes to say, yes, this is a complete sentence. So you want to make sure that you identify both the subjects and the verbs on your notes. I would prefer that you underline the subjects and circle the verbs, kind of like I have them on the slide, but if you want to do that differently in your notes, you're more than welcome to. In sentence number 2, it says she hated the house because of its size. So in this particular sentence, the action is hated, which is an emotion, and emotions can also be verbs sometimes. And the person who hated the house is the subject of the sentence, and in this case, it is she. Okay. Sentence number 3 says, I rode my bike to my friend's house. This sounds like a complete thought to me, and it has a verb. Riding their bike is the verb, and the person that was riding their bike to their friend's house is the subject I in this particular case. So that's why I've underlined that for you. So just a review, you need those 3 things to be a complete sentence. It's got to form a complete thought, and it must have a subject and verb. So let's now go ahead and talk about sentence fragments. So sentence fragments are incomplete sentences in some way because they're missing key components required for complete sentences. Fragments can sometimes be incomplete because they lack either a subject or a verb, or sometimes both. So they're lacking at least one or more of those key components to make a complete sentence, one of those 3 things at least. They can be missing all 3 sometimes. So if we're looking at some example sentence fragments, we have this first one that says bought some pizza. So I've highlighted the verb in green, so we know somebody bought pizza, but we don't know who bought the pizza. So that's what's missing. Our subject in yellow is missing. So the way you fix this is then to go back in and add a subject. So in this case, I said my sister, who is the subject, bought some pizza. So I have a subject and a verb, and now that forms a complete thought. So I have effectively fixed that first sentence fragment. Looking at sentence number 2, this says, with a groan, dropped the barbells. So dropped is highlighted in green because that is the subject, but we don't know who dropped them. So that's what's missing. We need to know who the subject is. So the way you fix this is to go in and add that detail to the sentence, or add in that subject. So I wrote this as, with a groan, the boy in the gym dropped the barbells. So that forms a complete thought. I don't need any additional information, so I have completed this sentence and effectively fixed this fragment. In the third example, it says, they lunch after class. That sounds really quirky to me because I definitely realize it's missing something. And in this case, it's missing the verb. We know they is the subject, but what did they do with their lunch? Did they eat it? Did they throw it away? Did they buy it? We're not sure. So the way you fix this particular sentence is to add in the word that shows you what action they're doing. So I said they ate their lunch after class. So they is still the subject, and then I added in that action word ate to show you the subject and the verb in the sentence. And then when I read it like that, it forms a complete thought and it doesn't need any more information. So we have a complete sentence again. The last example on this slide says, the students, their notes in class. Again, it's missing some information. It's missing that green thing, or the verb in this case. We know the students are the subjects, but we don't know what they did with their notes in class. So you need to fix this by adding in the verb. So I fixed this by saying the students wrote their notes in class. So the verb in this case would be wrote, and the subject is the students, and it forms a complete thought because I don't need any additional information. So it is a complete sentence now. I have fixed that fragment. So these are some examples that show you where a subject or verb is missing in these particular sentences, and that's why that makes them sentence fragments. There is, however, one more kind of sentence fragment, and those are sometimes called dependent clause fragments. So sometimes a fragment can have both a subject and a verb, but it's still a dependent clause, so it doesn't form a complete thought. And these fragments are called dependent clauses because they cannot stand on their own. They require more information to form a complete sentence. So even though they have a subject and a verb, which are both required to be complete sentences, they don't have a complete thought. So they're missing that last requirement. So in these examples, I've gone through and found the subjects and the verbs, but I have highlighted them all in that fuchsia color to show you that these are all dependent clauses, or they're incomplete thoughts, and you still have to add information to them even though a subject and verb are already present. So in this first example, it says, because his car was in the shop. Well, we have a subject, which is the car, and we have a verb, which is the word was, so that's a very passive verb, but it is still a verb. So the thing that's missing here is what he did since his car was in the shop, or what he did while his car was in the shop. So we know that the understood subject is going to be he, but we don't know what he did either. So the way we fix this is by adding those things in either before or after this dependent clause. So I fixed this by saying he walked to the bus stop because his car was in the shop. So now I know what he was doing while his car was in the shop, or as a result of his car being in the shop. He ended up walking to the bus stop. So if I read all of that together, I now officially have a complete thought, and I have a couple of subjects now in the sentence. I added the subject he on top of the subject that already existed, which was his car, and then he walked and his car was in the shop. So we have two subjects and two verbs in the sentence now, and that's okay. You can absolutely have sentences that have several subjects or verbs as long as they form complete thoughts. So in the second example, just to do some more practice, says after the rain stops. So the subject in this particular fragment is rain, and the rain ends up stopping at some point. That is the action. So the part that's missing here is what happens when the rain stops, or what happens as a result of the rain stopping. So you just have to add more details to this sentence to make it a complete thought, to show what's happening when the rain stops. So in my example sentence, I said, we will play outside after the rain stops. So I added that subject we in there, and I said, will play as the particular action that we're going to do when the rain stops. So all of that forms a complete thought now. I don't have to add any more details to it because I've added enough. And it's got a couple of subjects and a couple of verbs in there again, which is okay. So we have all three of the requirements for a complete sentence. In the third example, this fragment says, when you finally take the test. So we have the subject you, because this person is talking to you specifically, and then the action you're doing would be taking the test. So the part that's missing here is what happens when you take the test. We don't know. That is not disclosed to us, so we don't have a complete thought. So the way we fix that is by adding more information to it. So I said, you will feel relieved when you finally take the test. And that may or may not be the case, but I just wanted to write the sentence. So I have the subject you, which is the same subject you were given before, and then the verb here is will feel. So there's a linking verb attached to the word feel, and we can talk about different verb types at a later date, but that's a complex verb, sort of like there was in the second example. So by adding those additional details, I have now written a complete sentence because it forms a complete thought, and there are subjects and verbs present in this sentence, so I have all of the requirements. I have effectively fixed this dependent clause fragment. In all three of these examples, I chose to put the dependent clause at the end because it sort of streamlined our sentence structure a little bit, but in a couple of days, we will talk about writing complex sentences where you could possibly put the dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence. So we'll look at how to do that at a later date. But for now, this is the structure I wanted to stick with for you guys to try to simplify some things. So please go back and make sure you review the components of a complete sentence and make sure you know how to add in those things to fix those sentence fragments, and you should be good.